Hello, everybody. My name is Alexandra Vacru. I'm the Executive Director of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. And it's a pleasure to be presenting to you today a panel on reconsidering the resilience in Belarus. We have three experts, all associated in some way or another with Harvard and the Davis Center today. And I will briefly introduce them. They will then give some presentations, and then we will be happy to take questions. We are streaming this, so if you have questions along the way, please enter them in the chat and they will get flipped up to us here in the webinar and we can answer them. So our first speaker will be Olena Nikolayenko. She is a professor of political science at Fordham University and an associate of the Davis Center. And her recent book on youth movements and elections in Eastern Europe looked at nonviolent youth movements and the ways in which they interact with governments in Azerbaijan, Belarus, Georgia, Serbia, and Ukraine. She is going to be kicking off our presentation today with some context. Our second speaker will be Margarita Balmaceda. She is a professor of diplomacy and international relations at Seton University, also an associate of the Davis Center. And she's been working on Belarus ever since she went there on a Fulbright in 1997. She's written quite a bit on the country, including a book called Living the High Life in Minsk, Russian Energy Rents, Domestic Populism, and Belarus's Impending Crisis. And she has a new book coming out later this year, Russian Energy Chains, the remaking of technopolitics from Siberia to Ukraine to the European Union. And she's going to give us some of the economic context for the protests. And then finally, Volha Charnysh is an assistant professor of political science at MIT, originally from Belarus and a graduate of Harvard and the Davis Center. Her research examines the lasting effects of forced migration after World War II and the politics of authoritarian regimes in Europe and Eurasia. She's covered Belarus politics as an executive editor of Belarus Digest, and her work has appeared in the American Political Science Review, Comparative Political Studies, Foreign Affairs, The Washington Post, National Interest, and elsewhere. Olena, please.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining this discussion on current events in Belarus. And in my brief remarks, I'm going to focus on the role of civil society and nonviolent resistance in challenging the persistence of the current regime. So I'm going to start with just a very brief overview of main factors that political scientists have identified to explain the persistence of authoritarian regimes around the globe. In general, it's considered that the destruction of alternative centers of power and the weakness of civil society underpins the durability of authoritarian regimes. And another critical factor associated with authoritarian survival is the will and the capacity of the coercive apparatus to suppress dissent. State control over the economy and endowment with natural resources are also seen as tools that enable an autocrat to maintain a grip on power. And furthermore, external support in the form of military backing or economic loans bolsters the odds of authoritarian survival. And we can definitely see the presence of all these factors in the case of Belarus. Alexander Lukashenko has ruled the country for 26 years, but the 2020 elections challenged the survival of the closed authoritarian regime. And I'm going to just very briefly provide some context on the role of civil society during the elections in Belarus. For the past 20 years, elections in Belarus have been marred with a lot of electoral fraud. And according to the official results of elections, the level of the percentage of support for Lukashenko reached from 76%, the lowest, in 2001 to 83% in 2006 and 2015. And meanwhile, with the exception of the 2001 election, the level of support for an alternative presidential candidate was always below 10%. And of course, as we know, according to the official election results in the most recent presidential elections, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya allegedly received 10% of the popular vote. But it's not just vote rigging that has been a common feature of Belarusian politics, but also protests in the aftermath of elections. And in Belarus, every presidential elections in which Lukashenko participated since 2001 was accompanied by mass protests in the street. In September 2001, approximately 5,000 people went into the street on election night to challenge the results of the elections. But Vladimir Hancharik, a leader from the single candidate from the opposition at that time, was not ready to defend stolen votes and lead anti-government protests. So this protest quickly died down. In March 2006, already tens of thousands of people went into the street. And at that time, inspired in part by the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, a tent city was set up in downtown Minsk, but it was able to exist for just a few days and was violently dismantled on March 24th. And then in 2010, people again took to the street. According to some estimates, as many as 20,000 people protested in Minsk alone, and the police was successful in quickly suppressing this protest event. The political opposition was so demoralized in 2015 that hardly any protests were organized in the aftermath of the election. Tatiana Karatkevich, civic activist associated with the campaign to tell the truth, was, according to official results, she received just less than 5% of the popular vote, and there was a widespread belief that she couldn't really have won the election. But the public mood became totally different in the 2020, when there was a widespread belief in the electoral victory of the alternative candidate. And as a result, tens of thousands of people over the past months and a half protested against the government, and they employed diverse forms of civil resistance. And political scientists and sociologists have long acknowledged that non-violent protests might be more effective in achieving the ultimate goals than armed struggle. And Charnysh and Seton in their book demonstrated it using empirical evidence from a large number of non-violent uprisings. And in addition, non-violent uprisings generally attract great acceptance and legitimacy in the international community. So they often hailed as a viable mechanism for bringing about political change. In Belarus, there are several factors that sustain civil resistance against the regime, and I just wanted to highlight very briefly three of them. The first factor is the compliance with nonviolent discipline. It's quite remarkable that people have been marching in the street, have faced police cordons that did not employ any sort of violence against the police. There was not a single window broken. and instead they displayed creativity in challenging the regime by forming human chains, performing Belarusian language songs, and hanging flags on the buildings. Another critical factor that contributes to the persistence of nonviolent protests in Belarus is the development of a horizontal organizational structure. Many media reports suggest that the Telegram channel Nechta continues to play a critical role in disseminating information, but there is not a single leader who dictates the choice of protest tactics. Instead, people form or join informal social networks. There is a growth of courtyard chats, and that's why it's much more difficult for the government to suppress this type of resistance without the presence of a formal leader. And a third factor that I think distinguishes this wave of anti-regime mobilization is the development of a cross-cutting coalition of regime opponents. This time we can observe that it's not just professionals in the capital city who are standing up against the regime, not just IT sector professionals and teachers, but also factory workers and Pomosh miners try to challenge the regime by participating in protest actions or organizing strikes at their enterprises. And here I think it's appropriate also to recall what happened in Serbia in 2000. A devastating blow to the legitimacy of Slobodan Milosevic was delivered by coal miners at Kolubara coal mines, a small town not far from Belgrade, where they went on strike in the aftermath of the 2000 elections, federal elections. So just to sum up, I think that to wrap up my discussion, I think just the main question that remains on the agenda and that maybe we can discuss in this roundtable is the prospects for a peaceful transfer of power by peace without the use of violence. In the aftermath of the Orange Revolution in Ukraine and the Revolution of Dignity in 2013-2014, the Independent Institute for Socioeconomic and Political Studies, a leading polling organization in Belarus, conducted opinion polls in which they asked Belarusians whether they believe that a similar scenario as in Ukraine might be possible in Belarus. And at that time, the overwhelming majority of Belarusians do not believe that such events might unfold in their home country. Less than 20% of people in 2005 and less than 15% in 2014 felt that some sort of Maidan might break out in Belarus. And in particular, I think a lot of public opinion polls suggest that Belarusians have been very heavily influenced by Russian propaganda and have very negative views of the Maidan, of the Euromaidan in particular. But in the absence of massive security defections, a peaceful transfer of power from an autocrat to the popularly elected leader is hardly possible in a closed authoritarian regime. Lukashenko is determined to stay in power at any cost, and President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, is willing to prolong Lukashenko's rule, at least until he implements constitutional reforms and makes further concessions to the Kremlin. So we have yet to see whether there is a possibility for people's power to win without resort to violence. Thank you.
Olena, let me just ask a clarifying question. When people here are saying that they don't see the possibility of a Ukrainian scenario, and they're anti-Maidan, what exactly are they thinking of? What does that refer to? I mean, does it refer to the violence? Does it refer to an overthrow of the government? Does it refer to Lukashenko, being flown out through Rostov? What exactly, do we have any idea of what people are actually saying?
Well, I think that the Russian propaganda was quite effective in drawing the connection between popular uprising, between mass mobilization and violent conflict in eastern Ukraine. And I think that a lot of people might fear, I don't know, that if protesters resort to violence, then it will become a catalyst for a civil war in Belarus. So they're fearful of this scenario.
So they're not responding to the outcome of the protest per se. You think that it's hard, you can't tell from the question. You think they're responding to the possibility of, let's say, Belarus having some kind of conflict like the Ukrainians have in Eastern Ukraine?
Yeah. I mean, although I do agree with you that the way that this question is phrased is somewhat ambiguous. But I think that in the Russian media and a lot of Belarusians do watch Russian language TV, these two events became inseparable. The mass protests and the conflict that followed.
Okay, well, let's move on to some of the economic issues. You mentioned that having state control over the economy and natural resources is one of the ways authoritarian leaders stay in power. And we happen to have someone who's very familiar with how authoritarian leaders use energy politics to stay in power. So it's a pleasure for me to turn it over to you, Margarita.
Thank you. As Olena Nikolayenko just mentioned, this is not the first time that there are contested elections in Belarus. The last 5 elections have been contested. Every time there have been protests after the elections, more clearly in 2010, 2015. So the question is, what is different this time? And in my brief comments, I would like to address this from the perspective of economics, and in particular from the perspective of energy politics and relationships with stakeholders, both outside Belarus and within Belarus. And I would like to do this in 3 steps. First, I would like to say a few words about what has been the traditional model of the relationship between energy policies and authoritarian resilience in Belarus. Secondly, I would like to say a few words about how this model has come into pressure in the last years, in the last months, and how this is affecting the situation, Lukashenko's power, and also some of the things we have been seeing in the protests. And finally, I would like to say a few words about how this affects international negotiations around Belarus and around alternative outcomes in Belarus. So when we think about Belarus, we most often think of it as an energy poor country. It is not a major producer of crude oil or natural gas, but it plays a very important role in the fossil fuel economy and in the economy related to all kinds of industries related to fossil fuels through its role in refining oil, through its role in a number of industries that are fed by fossil fuels. And since our discipline has tremendously neglected the role of processing, the role of refining, we have not paid a lot of attention to this, but actually it has been really key for Belarus. So when we think about the Belarusian-Russian relationship and the energy side to it, perhaps we most often think about lower than market or lower than quote unquote market prices for natural gas, lower than market prices for oil. But actually the key element in that relationship has been the refining of Russian crude oil received under beneficial terms, lower than world prices, but most importantly, the refining of oil, including a variety of taxes and duties. It's a very complicated issue. If you're interested in that, read my book on this, which have allowed Belarus to actually benefit tremendously from this. And basically, in the entire period from 2005, Belarus has been able to fortify its budget by about 10% as a result of different energy relations with Russia. Of this, at least half has been related to lower than world prices for natural gas, but also about half having to do with the duties imposed by Belarus on oil products refined in Belarus from Russian crude oil. And this has been a tremendous source of income for the Belarusian regime and an important source of authoritarian resilience. This is really important because the way energy policies have worked in Belarus have both challenged our views of what kind of authoritarian regime Lukashenko's regime is or was recently, and challenged common views about the relationship with Russia. In terms of our common views of the relationship with Russia, we have tended to see Belarus as a faithful follower of Russian policies. Actually, if you look at the way Lukashenko has manipulated the relationship with Russia, and in particular the energy relationship with Russia, you will see something much more complicated that is not simply following Russian policy. But it also challenges our views of the Belarusian regime as a raw authoritarian regime based on sheer repression of its population, because the way the energy side of the Belarusian model worked, including relations with Russia, allowed for a much softer authoritarian regime based not only on sheer repression, which we are seeing now, but we did not see in the same way in the last 20 odd years, and based on rather an economic growth model, on a soft repression, and on incentives given to the population in a variety of ways. So let me briefly address what were some of the key elements of this model, and then how has this come under pressure. So obviously, one key element of this model had to do with the trickle-down effect of these economic interactions. Basically, about 10% of the Belarusian budget has been historically supported by those interactions, both the income from duties and taxes on exported oil products, gasoline, diesel, and so on, and from subsidized natural gas prices. That trickle-down effect allowed an economy which was actually in most of its sectors very, very outdated, but not in the refining sector, to survive. It also allowed consumer spending to continue. It allowed real wages to increase, perhaps not to the level Lukashenko constantly promised of $1,000 per month, but to continue growing. And it allowed the establishment of a Belarusian model of increased welfare. It also supported relatively high wages in those sectors of the economy related to oil refining and energy, and supported those sectors of the economy horizontally linked both to natural gas and to oil. For example, cement production, fertilizer production, and so on. I think none of this is new. What perhaps we have not paid enough attention to are two additional elements of how this energy political model worked. One element had to do with the way in which this model helped to cement a particular set of rules in the relationship between Lukashenko and his nomenclatura. And here I'm talking not only about the so-called siloviki, not only about the repressive apparatus, but about the economic nomenclatura, in particular those individuals related to the oil refining sector and the two major refineries in Novopolotsk and Naftan. Basically, the model that this type of energy income allowed to establish was a model in which these actors would play a role, but at the explicit exchange that they would not intervene in politics. And it clearly set a situation very, very different from that in Ukraine, where you not only had a much broader variety of economic interests, but much more vocal players. And the availability of income, open or perhaps veiled income from oil refining, set the stage for a very particular role for Belarusian proto-oligarchs, which never really allowed themselves to come out of the shadows. The second point that we perhaps do not pay very much attention to is how Belarus' role in oil refining actually also have created a particular dynamic in the relationship with external players, not only Russia, but the European Union. So which are the importers? Which countries are the importers of oil refined in Belarus, so-called petrol for gas and diesel? These are the European Union countries. This is first of all the Netherlands, which receives these oil products and exports and then redistributes it to the rest of Europe. In principle, that high dependence of Belarus on those exports would create a perfect situation for very, very effective economic sanctions against Belarus. But in no situation, either in 2010 or 2015 or today, has the European Union been willing to use that ultimate weapon, perhaps because it would be too effective for its own good. If you were to shut down imports from Belarus, perhaps this would not have a very key impact on the Netherlands or on the European Union, but it would have a tremendous impact on the Belarusian economy. So how have things changed in the last years? Well, one thing that has changed is that the way the world oil market has changed with the decrease in oil prices starting in the mid 2010s has very much affected Belarus, because now, even if Belarus is accessing Russian crude oil at lower prices than world prices, the differential between those crude oil prices and the price at which Belarus can sell refined oil are much, much smaller, and therefore the duties and taxes that can be imposed on that are much smaller. And again, the key point for Belarus, the key element in the income from this is related to duties and taxes. So what this means is that this is affecting the protest movement in a variety of ways. We have seen strikes in some of those industries which are most directly related to energy. So not directly in the refineries, but in Belarus Kali, producer of potash, in the Hrodno Azot, also producer of materials for fertilizers. And this also changes a lot in the geopolitical discussion around negotiations related to Belarus, because until now, the US had agreed to play a growing role in supplying crude oil to Belarus as a way of helping Belarus diversify away from Russia. This is part of a long-standing game on the part of Lukashenko. And our Secretary of State has argued that as a response to the growing repression in Belarus, the US may reconsider those crude oil shipments. Those crude oil shipments were never very large. And even throughout last year and this year, Belarus was still importing 90% of its crude oil from Russia. But this has been part of the discursive management by Lukashenko of his relationship with Russia, having this idea of the alternatives. And the response to the growing repression may limit Lukashenko's ability to use that or continue that game in that way, and perhaps create pressure for a closer relationship with Russia. So I'm going to close it now, and I'm happy to continue the discussion in the Q&A.
Thank you, Margarita. Let me just ask you one follow-up question also. You said that 10% of the Belarusian economy is dependent on these oil and gas duties and tariffs and things like that. Do you have any number that would indicate how dependent the Belarusian economy is on the sales to Europe? Is it less than that 10%?
Basically, the key element, the key figure here would be the amount of income from duties, and historically it has been about 3 billion. Mm-hmm. So this is about 4%, I believe, of GDP. Again, we cannot really separate the Russian side from the European side, because this is the oil from Russia that is refined in Belarus and sold to the EU.
So the 10% is not kind of, let's say, a gift from Russia, right, because of low oil prices and special duties, but it combines the benefit from Russia of low inputs and the benefit from Europe from the duties imposed on what is being exported.
And again, here, Lukashenko has been a genius. So I'm very sorry to have to defend him, but having studied Ukraine, having studied other quote-unquote energy poor countries for many years, he was until now a genius in managing that energy relationship, because he was able to extract much more than others, perhaps because he didn't have to share it with many others. Yes, so it was not simply a gift, it was a very complex calculation and game, a game in which also Russian players played an important role, because, for example, in the early 2000s, Belarus was given a particular status through which exports to Belarus, exports of crude oil to Belarus would not be considered exports, so would not be taxed, would not be subject to taxes. This benefited Russian producers. So it's a complex relationship there.
All right, wonderful. Last but not least, Volha.
Thank you, Alexandra. I'm going to share my screen and try to keep it short so we get into Q&A. In my remarks, I will cover some of the changes in Belarusian society that led to the protests, and then talk a little bit about what might come next, purely speculatively. So what we're witnessing is unprecedented mobilization against the regime in Belarus. In the past, each election had a little bit of protest, but very small scale. Opposition was always divided, and the regime always responded with repression. But as a result of much lower levels of societal mobilization, repression touched a lot fewer lives. And in 2015, nothing happened at all in the midst of the Ukrainian crisis. Now, this sixth time is clearly different, and I think that it reflects a combination of changes in Belarusian society, in particular, the increase in latent mobilizational capacity of Belarusian society, and a bunch of mistakes by the Lukashenko regime. So Belarusian society has changed since the country's independence, but particularly rapidly in the last 10 years. The majority of the population lives in urban areas. People are online. They're fully connected, and they can tap into media all across the world. So many of them probably read Russian language media. There were no serious internet restrictions in Belarus until now, and all sources of information were easily accessible. At the same time, Belarusian population has always been very highly educated. And over time, there's been increasing exposure to Europe. Despite all, because it's been rather hard to travel with Schengen visa rules, Belarusians have had higher incomes, which enabled them to travel, to work, and to study abroad. Over this time, even though Belarus remained dependent on Russia's energy and its economy was not reformed for the most part, it did manage to develop its technology sector. So by the 2020, it reached 8% of the GDP, and there were these hopes that Belarus will be an outsourcing hub for European programming, and it reflects just kind of the changes that took place in Belarus economy, despite some of the policies adopted by the Lukashenko regime. During this time, Belarus also has acquired a large diaspora abroad. All of these people are socialized in democratic states. A lot of people emigrated in the 90s and continued on, many of them to the EU and to the United States. Belarus has been independent since 1991, and so a sort of cohesive national identity developed. Maybe it's a different type of identity with speaking Russian language, with viewing Russia as, and reunion with Russia rather positively. But overall, the majority of Belarusians, according to opinion polls, agree on the fact that Belarus is a sovereign country and that they are Belarusian, no matter what language they speak. There have been a number of exciting initiatives to popularize Belarusian history, to popularize Belarusian language, and even the Lukashenko regime toward the end of this period has stepped in and tried to promote its Belarusian credentials. And finally, Belarusian generations are increasingly removed from the Soviet past, removed from the difficulties of transition out of the Soviet past, and are not thinking about World War II as the most formative experience in Belarusian history. Now, even as the Belarusian society has changed dramatically over this period, the regime did not really change since 1994. 94 is when Lukashenko was elected with 45% of the vote, and he stayed in power ever since. And so here you see actually some cartoons I drew while a graduate student at Harvard, and strikingly, they're basically still relevant today. So Lukashenko keeps winning. He wins through electoral manipulation, and this has not changed since '94. Media, even though internet has been relatively free, there have been some attempts to restrict media, especially print media, to cover up, especially during times of economic crisis. Lukashenko still remained very much dependent on Russia, in a very tight relationship with Russia. And Belarusian economy has been going through ups and downs, but because of the lack of reform, it has always been in a rather precarious position. So essentially, Belarus remains ruled by the same corrupt, now 65-year-old leader who came into politics after managing a collective farm, and has been relying on state TV broadcasts where he's shown picking harvests and cultivating a certain image that might not resonate with the more educated younger segments of the Belarusian population. So even as as the society has changed, regime remained the same old regime. There have been a few triggers ahead of this election that contributed to the fact that this existing mobilization potential actually culminated in mass unrest and protests around the election. So one is actually, the COVID crisis. So here you see an image circulated in social networks that talks about the fact that even as COVID-19 is spreading all around the world, in Belarus, you really just have some viral respiratory infections. So this refers to the fact that Lukashenko did not acknowledge the crisis in Belarus, even though people kept getting sick. There have been a lot of fake diagnostics and refusal to publish accurate statistics on the crisis. And all of this has encouraged the Belarusian population to search news abroad about how to protect themselves, which taught them that all the other countries, including Russia, are actually taking some measures against the epidemic. It also turned out to be a dress rehearsal for post-election protests, because people organized crowdfunding campaigns to provide medical workers with equipment. They created informational videos about the spread of the virus, and they publicized some of the cases where people died but were diagnosed as having something else. Importantly, a lot of people who normally would work abroad in Europe or in Russia, or who would simply vacation in Europe around the election time, which was in August, were actually stuck in Belarus now. So all of these people probably were not fond of the regime, but they were apolitical and they were not interested in doing much about it. But now they were suddenly home with time on their hands. And of course, the virus contributed to economic troubles. So usually ahead of the elections, Lukashenko would give some handouts, increase wages, increase pensions. And this was one election where he couldn't really afford this. And this situation is only gonna get worse with time as the entire world is nearing a recession. So this was a unique election in a way because opposition was united. It's never happened before, and it wouldn't have happened this time if not for the regime's imprisonment of viable opposition candidates and a miscalculation by registering Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, wife of a popular blogger who was not registered as candidate. So suddenly we have a united opposition, and what the opposition was asking was simply a free and fair election, rather than arguing over policy issues or bringing up geopolitical concerns that would probably alienate Belarusian electorates. This is kind of thing that most Belarusians could get behind of. All right, and finally, as Olena mentioned, protests encountered massive police brutality already in the first days after the election. Over 6,000 people were arrested, and this actually backfired. So today in Belarus, many people know personally at least one person arrested by OMON brutally, and that certainly does not improve the legitimacy of the regime. So what happens next? And so here, I hope my comments will be, useful for the discussion of the prospects for the end of authoritarianism in Belarus, for perhaps democracy or not. So Daniel Treisman, a political scientist, has argued that a lot of democratic transitions occurred by mistake. Regimes miscalculate, and democracy occurs. It's never by design. How likely is it in the case of Belarus? Well, I think in the short term, probably not likely, but I think that the protests that are going on now are partly as a result of miscalculations by the regime. I think what is more likely in the short term is this transition to a more repressive and unstable authoritarian rule. Certainly repression was always there in Belarus, but it never touched so many lives. With Lukashenko's legitimacy significantly reduced, there will be more need for more open repression. There might be much more wide-scale attempt to control information. So in Belarus, in the past, you could access any website, but during the protests, a lot of internet was simply down. Websites of independent media were shut down, and Belarus has been using some of technology from China to restrict access to specific websites and channels. And so I think we will see more of this in the coming times. So important things to think about are certainly Russia. So everyone has been wondering what Russia will do, and a lot of, especially Western media, have been regularly publishing sensationalist headlines with Putin said this, Putin said that, all implying massive near-term intervention in Belarusian affairs. So Russia is certainly an important player. It will probably continue to influence domestic situation in Belarus, but I think that its influence will be somewhat more nuanced. In particular, it will continue to provide support for the Lukashenko regime until it realizes that he can no longer stay for a long time and then switches its allegiances. And it will probably continue to engage in information warfare and control information about the events of Belarus at home. So I think from Putin's perspective in particular, this example of peaceful protesters succeeding, now they haven't certainly succeeded yet, but had they been successful, it's a very dangerous example. So I think Russia has been watching very carefully, but the striking things I found online based on surveys from the Levada Center show that a considerable proportion of Russians believe that Lukashenko should actually stay president. So something like 57% at the end of August haven't witnessed protests in Belarus, haven't witnessed the violence. And 39% of Russian respondents views the protests as negative. So this is striking, but that kind of says something about how information about protests is managed in Russia, on the Russian side. Okay, and the final point is the Ukrainian scenario. I'll go over this very briefly just because we've already touched on this. So I believe the Ukrainian scenario is very relevant, but not because Belarus is in any way like Ukraine. So there are many differences. Most importantly, Ukraine at the time was already much more democratic, so consequences for protesting were a lot lower. Ukraine was much less homogeneous in terms of its views, and there were differences between East and West Ukraine, and there was real risk that Ukraine would turn decisively toward the EU in its policies. Nothing like this is happening in Belarus, but the Ukrainian scenario has been an important lesson for Lukashenko, for Belarusian people, and for EU and Russia as well. So in Belarus, the Maidan is viewed far from positively, and a lot of the time what Lukashenko says is, I will not let the Maidan happen in Belarus. He himself learned from the experience and immediately increased and revamped his security services and so on. But Belarusians themselves would like Maidan not to happen. They are essentially worried about Russia's intervention, and a lot of the time the protesters have been careful not to signal anything anti-Russian in their stance. The same goes for the Coordination Council. Now, EU also learned from the Ukrainian scenario, and I think that's why it's essentially staying away and having very mixed statements on the brutality that is happening in Belarus. So compare that to 2010 reaction by the EU, which was much more clear-cut denunciation of violence and imposition of sanctions. Nothing like this is so far happening today. Russia also learned. It did annex Crimea, but I think ultimately it was a very costly intervention on Russia's part, and I don't think Moscow would like to repeat something like this. So I think all of those factors matter, and so I will conclude because I'm really looking forward to at least some of the Q&A at the end of my talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Volha. So we have a couple interesting questions. One, I think you already spoke to, Volha, which someone was asking if they think that the colder weather and kind of exhaustion are going to cause the protest to die down, which you seem to think is likely. But I wanted to ask Olena if you have an opinion, given your work on youth and nonviolent protests, what do you expect to happen in the next months or so as far as the protests are concerned?
Thank you. First, I wanted to correct myself a little bit. When I spoke earlier, when I looked back at the slide and the results of the public opinion poll, they were conducted in March 2014, so before violence really broke out in Eastern Ukraine. So when that question was asked about the Ukrainian scenario, at that time, Belarusians did reflect just on the use of violence by protesters. And apparently a lot of Belarusians did not feel prepared or did not think that it would be possible for a lot of people to use violent means against the regime to bring it down. But at the same time, I wanted to mention also maybe a very forgotten organization in Belarusian history, CRY, which was a breakaway from the Youth Front in the 1990s. And this sports organization, if it can be called this way, organized a lot of military drills and also provided some education on Belarusian history and the Belarusian language for its members. And oftentimes in the 1990s, when protests were held, and the early 2000s, when protests were held against Lukashenko, members of this organization were in the forefront trying to bear the brunt of police violence. So we can't really, so even despite the fact that nowadays, of course, a lot of Aneris and Belarusians themselves claim that they are very peaceful and they are very hostile to the idea of using violence. But there were some maybe marginal but still initiatives earlier during Lukashenko's presidency to try and use the same weapons to some extent against the repressive political regime. I think that, you know, Lukashenko is determined to crush this protest movement before his inauguration date, because, well, I mean, he's supposed to take the oath as far as the inauguration ceremony. I think is required to be held 2 months, up to 2 months after the election. So the election was held on August 9, and we have until October 9th, just a few weeks left. So I think this 2 weeks would be very critical in determining the fate of this protest movement. Because if Lukashenko becomes inaugurated as the president again, we might find ourselves in the same situation as the people in Venezuela, where they basically have 2 governments, one that is backed by the Russian government and a handful of political regimes, and another one that is more fully supported by ordinary citizens.
So let me ask all of you a question, if you have thoughts of it. How likely is it that some of the senior officials in Lukashenko's government might defect and join the opposition? Because that surely must be part of the calculation.
My sense is, you know, a few people have defected early, but you know, at this point, people who have not defected will not. The moment has, you know, has been exhausted for that stage, and they see that you know, Lukashenko is digging in and he's firmly in power and control of the situation. So, unfortunately, I expect no additional big name defections.
Margarita, you're muted. No.
Yes, I would like to add something to this. I agree with Volha that perhaps the tide has turned. I think now repression is the order of the day, and I do not expect to see a lot of high-level defections. However, it's important to note that Lukashenko was and is tremendously worried about this. One of the first things he did in August was to give special medals and honors to about 200 Silaviki, exactly because he was afraid of this. So it may not happen immediately, but I think we are setting the stage for a very different game the next time.
Margarita, while I have you on the line, as it were, could you speak a little bit to what Lukashenko expects the Americans to do? Trump has been very silent, but obviously there was some nascent economic relationship there when you talk about the alternative supply of crude oil. Do they think that has any potential?
So Lukashenko has been very skillfully playing the EU versus Russia and the US versus Russia, the US idea that US fossil fuel supplies may help save countries like Ukraine or Belarus from Russian hegemony. I don't think that that relationship has ever been very realistic in the long term, if only because we are talking about very minuscule supplies, but it has been important discursively in terms of Lukashenko showing to Russia that he had alternatives. So unfortunately, now he's going to lose that possibility, because I think the chances of the US suspending those new supplies of crude oil are very high as a way of making a concession to those groups in the US Congress who would like to see stronger sanctions. So this is a problem, because this will push Belarus closer to relations with Russia on whatever terms Russia wants.
So another interesting discursive element has been the role of women in the leadership of the opposition and the way Lukashenko has responded to them, apparently making some miscalculations along the way. Is there any significance to the fact that all of the leaders of the opposition right now are women? Does that help their case? Does it make it easier to repress or less likely that it will succeed? How is it perceived by Belarusian society?
So my take on this is that Lukashenko miscalculated because he underestimates women, and even before this case, he would always say some stuff about women's presumed peaceful domestic qualities that make them unfit to be leaders, while emphasizing that he values them a lot. I think repressing women who are marching in white with flowers is much more damaging for the regime's image. So, also the fact that Tikhanovskaya emphasized her image as a housewife and a political person must have attracted some of the apolitical people who, would say, whatever Lukashenko does, whatever the opposition does, I don't care, but I do want to have a decent life for my children. And so the emphasis on this kind of peaceful qualities, we are not going into politics for power, but we're going to protect our future, and that actually helps the image of the protesters. But as we have seen, eventually the regime did not hesitate, and also a bunch of women were arrested, some rather brutally. So bad for the image, but the image is already pretty bad.
Even the grandmothers are getting picked up now and hauled away. Olena, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I think it really inadvertently helped Belarusians that Lukashenko had such a condescending view of women, and totally dismissed them as political actors, because otherwise he would not have allowed Svetlana Tikhanovskaya to register as a presidential candidate. I just want to point out that I mentioned earlier Tatiana Karatkevich. I think back in 2015 she received officially less than 5% of the popular vote. The political opposition had very mixed attitudes about her, and questioned to some extent her democratic credentials, so I think Lukashenko assumed that the same would happen again during this election, where just a lot of people would not take Tikhanovskaya seriously. And back in 2015, he referred on several occasions to this female presidential candidate as a person in skirt. And he said that how can a person in skirt handle the responsibilities associated with presidency. In particular, he pointed out that a woman was unfit to be a commander-in-chief because she cannot walk in a skirt in front of like military line. And of course, more recently, he claimed that the Belarusian constitution is not designed for a woman to lead the country, because it empowers the president with so many powers that would be overwhelming for any woman to handle.
Of course. Yeah.
So,
well, I would be surprised if any of the distinguished scholars on this panel are still wearing skirts, as they're doing everything from home. But regardless of that, it's clear that the quality of the discussion and of the presentations has been very high. Thank you so much for participating. And I hope that we can get back and continue discussing Belarus's transition, ideally towards something positive rather than something negative in the future.